The Galactic Tribunal was no ordinary courtroom. It was a massive chamber carved into the heart of an asteroid orbiting a cold blue star, and inside this chamber were seated delegates from over 70 alien civilizations, each one cloaked in centuries of politics, pride, and prejudice. Today, they had gathered to put a single man on trial, a representative of Earth summoned not just to speak but to answer for what the galaxy called a crime of war. They expected power, or at least the appearance of it. They expected armored escorts, battle-ready guards, maybe even an artificial intelligence to stand beside him, but what they saw instead confused them. The chamber doors opened with a soft hum, and in walked a human alone, wearing a plain gray suit, carrying no weapons, no bags, and no guards. His name was Reed, and his steps echoed through the marble floor, as if he had all the time in the world. Alien Council watched with narrowed eyes, long necks turned, eye stalks twitched, biolenses recorded every movement from the stands. The whispers started low, first questioning, then judging. Some found it amusing that Earth had sent a single man for such a serious hearing. Some believed it to be arrogance. Others saw it as foolishness, but none of them knew what he truly was. Reed stood still at the center of the arena-shaped court. Beneath the high, semi-transparent dome where the star's cold light filtered in, creating a pale glow on his face. His hands were folded behind his back, and his expression was unreadable, not calm, not proud, just silent, like a mountain watching a storm. From the elevated seat at the center spoke the lead speaker of the tribunal, a tall, thin creature whose voice sounded like wind over broken glass. The charges were stated quickly. Earth was accused of violating a protected region, destroying a research colony that belonged to a neutral system, and using military force without authorization from the Accord Council. Reed did not flinch while the accusations piled up. He listened, not once looking around, not once blinking too fast. He just stood there, letting them speak, as if waiting for something, as if timing something. The lead speaker asked if he had anything to say. Reed's voice was steady, not loud, not sharp, just a flat, even tone that somehow carried through the whole chamber. He said, "I am here to present Earth's position and the facts that support it, nothing more, nothing less." The chamber filled again with murmurs who saw this as a weak defense. Others were annoyed by his lack of emotion. One alien delegate, a loud, bulky creature with armor fused into its skin, slammed its hand down, calling Reed a coward who hides behind words, not courage. Another delegate, a smaller but venomous species, hissed that humans were known for hiding weapons behind false peace offers. Reed didn't reply, not to the insults, not to the stares, not even when a few delegates laughed openly. His silence became louder than their noise, and his stillness seemed unnatural, not robotic, not afraid but calculated, and that unsettled a few of the older council members who had seen enough wars to know when someone was pretending and when someone was waiting. The evidence was shown through floating screens, holographic projections detailing the destruction of the colony from multiple angles. Footage showed Earth ships in the region moments before the explosion. Data logs pointed toward high-energy human weapons being detected in the area. There were heat signatures, there were dead communications. It looked bad, and it looked deliberate. Reed raised a single hand to request a pause, and after a moment the lead speaker allowed it. In that pause, Reed said one sentence, "Do you truly wish to know what happened?" The question hung in the air, heavier than any argument, more solid than any proof. The chamber went quiet, not because of the words, but because of the way he said them. No doubt, no plea, just certainty. One alien delegate, a feathered diplomat with sharp metallic wings, laughed and said, "We already do. Your silence only confirms it. You bring no counter, only delay." But that was when Reed reached into his suit and pulled out a small cube about the size of a palm. He placed it gently on the platform and tapped it twice. The lights above dimmed, and the cube projected a new stream of data. Without changing his voice, Reed said, "This is what really happened." Projection filled the dome, this time from a different angle, different time code, and from a human military probe. It showed the colony under attack, not by Earth, not by humans, but by unknown vessels bearing false Registry codes, the footage slowed and analyzed patterns revealing cloaked ships mercenaries firing on the stations. Own defenses and killing civilians inside. It showed the Earth ships entering later responding to a distress signal, one that was encrypted and almost lost in the chaos in. The crowd some gasped, others leaned forward. The lead speaker ordered silence. And the footage kept rolling, showing how the human fleet disabled the attackers without touching the colony itself. It ended with a scan proving that the core explosion was caused from within, likely by the same mercenaries trying to cover their tracks. Reed said nothing after it ended. He simply stepped back, hands behind his back again. Posture unchanged, not looking at anyone, yet somehow staring at them all now. The tone of the room shifted. Confusion replaced arrogance, suspicion replaced laughter. The delegates began to glance at each other, questioning the original report. Some began to pull up files, checking dates, cross-referencing names. A few turned their attention to the delegate who had led the charges earlier, being known for its history of political ambition and covert operations. That delegate's skin turned slightly dull, as if the blood beneath had gone cold. It stood up, demanding to know where this footage came from and on whose authority it had been collected. Reed finally looked up and said simply, "Earth does not collect data without reason. We knew this day would come, and we wanted to be ready." The room stilled once again, and now the diplomats were no longer looking at a weak human in a suit. They were trying to see the weapon they had missed the entire time. The silence that followed was not empty, it was thick, filled with thousands of questions. None spoken aloud, because even the boldest voices had fallen quiet. The cube's light had faded, but its impact remained echoing in every corner of the tribunal hall, as if the truth had left a scent that no one could ignore. The alien delegates now shifted in their seats. The same ones who had been so eager to accuse now struggled to meet the human's eyes, not because Reed stared at them with fire, but because he didn't need to. He stood there without a flicker of pride or vengeance, and that unnerved them more than rage ever could. The lead speaker's long fingers curled slightly, a subtle sign of uncertainty. The tribunal had always believed in evidence, but this was something more. This was a layered trap, not built to harm, but to reveal, and Reed had triggered it at the perfect moment. His calm demeanor was no longer seen as passive, it was strategic and dangerous, because in a room full of beings trained in diplomacy, warfare, and deception, he had walked in with nothing but the truth and waited for the right second to unfold it. But the story wasn't over yet, because not everyone in the room wanted peace. Not everyone was willing to accept that the narrative had flipped. Some had already made promises to their homeworlds that Earth would be punished. Some had made deals under the table assuming humans would fold under pressure, and now that assumption had shattered. The accusing delegate, known simply as Merrick, was the first to speak again. His voice sharper this time, edged with controlled panic. He accused the human footage of manipulation, claimed the holograms were forged, said the encryption might have been planted, and suggested Earth had prepared this months in advance, knowing they would be summoned, as if Earth was playing a longer, darker game, one meant to cover even greater crimes. Reed did not interrupt. He let Merrick speak, watched him weave excuses from desperation and fear. Then, when the time was right, he took one step forward and spoke with the same flat, steady tone that had now become heavier than any weapon. He said, "Earth does not manipulate what speaks for itself. Our probes record everything for our own protection. We do not beg for truth. We bring it when silence threatens to bury it." A few delegates murmured again. One of the elders leaned toward the lead speaker and asked for a deeper scan of the data logs. The lead speaker approved it immediately, and while systems began checking the authenticity of Reed's evidence, he remained still, not once looking hurried or concerned. It was as though every second of this had already been calculated, already measured, and now unfolding exactly as he had known it would. One delegate, a pale green-skinned diplomat from a race known for emotional empathy, stood up and asked Reed a direct question. If Earth had known about the colony's attackers, if they had known they were being framed, why did they not send a warning To the council earlier, "Why wait for a courtroom?" Reed replied. "Because sometimes truth must walk into fire to be seen. Because if we had spoken too soon, we would have been ignored. But now you see, and you cannot unsee." The words were not loud, but they carried like thunder across the marble chamber. The empath sat down slowly, his skin darkening in contemplation. Another delegate. This one from a warrior species growled low in his throat, not in anger, but in reluctant respect. There was something primal about the way Reed handled pressure, not with dominance, not with threat, but with complete control, and it reminded the warriors of ancient leaders, who never raised their voices yet always won their battles. Meanwhile, the data analysis completed. It returned with confirmation. The holographic projections were untouched, the encryption layers were real, the source was genuine. The timeline matched perfectly with earlier logs, but had been hidden in the council's own archives, likely suppressed. By someone with access now, suspicion turned sharper, but it no longer pointed at Earth. It pointed at Merrick, who stood frozen, no longer accusing, now sweating beneath his scaled skin, because the tides had shifted, and they had not shifted in silence. They had turned loud and clear, and Absolute Reed still did not gloat. He simply turned to the lead speaker and said, "Earth has no interest in conflict. We did not come to argue. We came to remove the knife pointed at our back. We came to ensure our silence was not misunderstood as weakness, and that our restraint was not seen as surrender." Lead speaker looked down at him, long gaze unmoving, then turned toward the rest of the council and said, "We must review everything again from the beginning. With all evidence, including the human record. Merrick, you will step down from the table until this is resolved." Merrick opened his mouth to protest, but no sound came. He knew the mask had fallen, and whatever protection he once had now vanished under the weight of exposed truth and public shame. Guards moved toward him, not in violence, but in quiet order, escorting him from the chamber as dozens of eyes followed his retreat. Reed watched without blinking, his expression unchanged, and for the first time the tribunal realized what they were dealing with: not a soldier, not a spy, not a soft-talking diplomat, but something else, something crafted by Earth to walk into enemy halls and dismantle lies without raising a weapon, something far more efficient than violence. As the council began reorganizing the session, as new documents were called and old testimonies reviewed, Reed stepped back again to his place, hands folded, calm as ever. And yet the entire room felt different now, because now everyone knew that the man in the plain gray suit had just shifted the balance of power without taking a single step outside that ring of truth. The tribunal chamber was no longer filled with pride and certainty. It had become a field of quiet unrest, a place where silence felt louder than speech, and every glance carried the weight of doubt. The alien council had built its order on rules and power, on fear and alliances, but now all those layers were trembling, not because of warships, not because of armies, but because of a single human who spoke with no threats, made no gestures, yet held their attention like gravity itself. Reed remained where he stood, still, quiet, hands behind his back, his eyes neither challenging nor passive, just watching the unraveling of a carefully built illusion. The council members shifted uncomfortably, some now going through files again, trying to find cracks they had once ignored. Others whispered among themselves, their words too soft to catch, yet heavy with change. The lead speaker ordered a full decryption of the suppressed signals. Earth had provided access codes to their side of the transmission logs, and it didn't take long for the truth to spill from the machines in the corners of the chamber. Multiple layers of coded transmissions were unlocked, showing requests for help from the human research station, warnings of unidentified ships, nearby calls that were ignored, calls that someone in the council had blocked before they ever reached the central communication towers. Now there was no laughter, no mocking smiles. Even the skeptical delegates, who once sat back with folded arms, leaned forward, eyes locked on the screen. The hologram showed the attackers arriving silently, cloaked with false identification markers. Then they showed the station's distress signals being jammed, and finally the attackers opening fire, destroying their own landing bay. to hide their origin before the human ships arrived. When the human ships did arrive, they did not attack first. They broadcasted 3 times trying to identify the vessels, refusing to fire, until the colony core began overheating. That was when Earth responded, and it responded fast with surgical precision, taking down all hostiles within minutes. Without touching any civilian vessel, without targeting anyone who wasn't firing at them. Entire narrative had flipped upside down, and Reed had let it happen piece by piece. Without rushing, without emotion, letting the council trap itself in its own assumptions. Now one of the warrior race delegates, a thick-scaled being known for battle honor, stood and spoke not with anger, but with clarity. The evidence is true. The attack was not done by Earth. The response was not a crime, it was protection. And those who accused falsely have betrayed this council's purpose. A few others nodded one by one. The air began to change. It was not yet friendly, but it was no longer hostile. It was cautious, it was alert, and it was now aware that the human standing before them was not what he appeared to be. Another delegate asked a question not with hostility, but with curiosity. If you had this evidence all along, why not confront the attackers directly? Why wait until now? Reed responded, in that same calm voice. Because Earth believes in law, because Earth wanted to trust this council would seek justice, not vengeance, and because sometimes truth must be allowed to arrive on its own path, so no one can say it was pushed, forced, or fabricated. The answer was simple yet undeniable, and for a long moment, no one spoke again. Then a low sound echoed through the chamber, a ripple of soft approval, not clapping, not cheering, but the sound of minds changing. The lead speaker adjusted his seat and turned toward Reed, saying, "You knew this would happen, did you not? You came prepared not for defense, but for a shift in balance." Reed met his gaze and said, "I came to reveal, not to threaten. I came because Earth is tired of being misunderstood, and we would rather walk into your courtroom than send fleets into your orbit." The message was clear and powerful, not loud, not boastful, just honest. And in that honesty was a strength no one had expected. One of the oldest council members, an ancient species with translucent skin and thousands of years of memory, stood slowly and spoke with a voice like falling leaves. "We have seen many rise and fall through the ages, but rarely do we see a species rise with such restraint, with such precision. Your diplomat carries no weapons, yet he has broken the blade of deception with truth, and for that he has earned more than our attention. He has earned our respect." A murmur of agreement moved through the room, like a wave, even among those who still carried doubt. The weight of the facts had become undeniable, and the man in the suit had become more than a witness. He had become a force not of destruction, but of correction. Merrick now stood alone in the corner, watched silent, his earlier pride stripped away, his alliances broken. He stared at Reed with a mixture of hatred and fear, not because Reed had harmed him, but because he had outplayed him without lifting a hand, without showing teeth or fury. Just by knowing more, just by staying still until the right moment came. The tribunal now moved to erase the charges against Earth and to launch an investigation into the false reports. The motion passed without resistance. The vote was nearly unanimous, and for the first time in the tribunal's long history, a human had stood trial and walked out not just free, but elevated. And through it all, Reed said little. He didn't celebrate, he didn't smirk, he didn't shake hands or offer words of triumph. He only waited until the last seal was stamped, and then turned slowly toward the exit, as if this entire storm had been nothing more than another day in his duty. As he walked out of the central circle, the hall watched in silence, and not one among them believed he was just a diplomat anymore. They had seen his method, they had seen his patience, they had seen the power that hid behind the suit, and they knew now without doubt that Earth had not sent a representative, they had sent a message outside the tribunal chamber. The corridors were long, wide, silent, made of polished silver walls that reflected cold light, but no warmth. Guards stood by the edges, tall and still, yet none dared block the path as Reed walked through them, each step quiet, but carrying the echo of power. He had not spoken since leaving the circle. He had not looked back, Not because of pride, but because his mission was not about proving something to them. It was about proving something to the galaxy behind him. The council remained shaken, not from a battle of ships, but from a war of knowledge, one that had turned without warning, one that had ended without fire, yet left scars deeper than any weapon could have done. Many of them were still seated, still watching the empty space where Reed had stood, their minds replaying every moment, every sentence, every pause, and realizing too late that they had not been in control at any point inside. A private hall reserved only for envoys of Earth. Two men waited. One was a security officer, the other a data handler. Both wore simple uniforms, but carried the weight of human authority in their silence. When Reed entered, they stood at attention, not because of his rank, but because of who he was and what he represented. The officer asked if the objective was completed, and Reed simply nodded, but that nod meant more than approval. It meant that Earth had done what no other species had dared to do. They had walked into judgment not to plead, but to reveal. They had allowed the game to play out and then turned the board over without lifting a finger. Reed removed his suit jacket and sat quietly as the data handler brought him a fresh report. Signals from Earth, direct transmission from the Office of Interstellar Affairs, confirming the tribunal's reversal, confirming the exposure of the fabricated evidence, confirming that the Council was now re-evaluating its protocols, and most importantly confirming that Earth was no longer seen as the accused, but as the observer, the one who had come not to fight but to witness and expose. But even now Reed showed no sign of satisfaction, because he knew this was not the end. It was only the surface beneath the council chambers. Behind smiling faces and diplomatic language, there were networks of power, networks that had underestimated humans, and now would not make that mistake again. Some would respect them, others would fear them. A few might even try to strike from the shadows, and he had to be ready for that. He leaned back, closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the earlier years when he first entered the program. He had not been trained to speak with charm or to convince with flattery. He had been trained to read patterns, to see intentions hidden beneath words, to use silence like a blade and information like armor. He had been taught how to walk into hostile space and disarm a room with nothing more than facts and timing. They called him a diplomat, but those who trained him knew better. He was a strategic weapon, dressed in words, a scalpel, not a sword, sent into places where fire would fail, and fire was exactly what his enemies had expected. They'd expected human fleets. They had expected retaliation and war, but instead they received him quiet, calm, with a voice like glass and a memory like steel. Meanwhile, deep within the council building, members of the inner circle gathered again. This time not in the open chamber, but in a restricted vault where no recordings were allowed. They spoke in hushed tones about Earth, about what had just occurred, about the risk of letting humanity grow unchecked. Some feared what might come next. Others suggested alliances must shift quickly before humans established influence in other systems. But the oldest among them, a being whose mind stretched over generations, said something that silenced the rest. Earth is not rising. They have already risen. We simply failed to notice until now. And when someone asked what they should do, the elder said, watch them. Learn from them or be replaced by them. There is no middle ground anymore. At the same time, far across the galaxy and the Earth, diplomatic center messages flooded in from other worlds, offers of neutral talks, proposals of trade requests for Earth to help mediate disputes among races that once ignored them. Suddenly everyone wanted their voice. Everyone wanted their insight, and the reason was not power but respect, earned not through warships, but through clarity and truth. Back in the envoy hall, Reed read the reports, but his thoughts were already ahead of the words. He could see the new threads forming, alliances that would shift enemies who would disguise their intentions, retaliation that would not come with fleets but with whispers. And that was where he thrived, not in battles, but in the space between battles where real victories were shaped. The officer spoke again, asking if they would return to Earth soon, but Reed shook his head. There was more to do, more layers to pull back. Because the tribunal had been only one stage of a larger web, and now that Earth had revealed its strength, the hidden players would move faster to protect their interests. They would adapt, they would evolve, and Earth would need to stay ahead. He stood once more, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, glancing in the mirror, not to admire himself, but to check that the suit still fit. Just right, not wrinkled, not damaged, because that suit was part of the weapon too. It was the cover, the mask, the symbol of control, calm, logic, reason in the face of chaos. And it was a message to anyone watching that humans no longer approached the stars as newcomers. They stood among the stars as equals, and they had come prepared. Outside the chamber, wind stirred dust across the landing bay where Earth's shuttle rested, its metal surface shining under the cold light of the alien sun, and Reed stepped toward it, not fast, not slow, simply with the same rhythm he always carried, the rhythm of someone who understood. Every step mattered, every glance had weight, and every word was a tool waiting to be used. Shuttle lifted quietly from the platform, its engines low and smooth, barely disturbing the dust that spun in slow spirals beneath its wings. And inside the cabin, Reed sat alone, his gaze fixed not on the stars ahead, but on the screen before him, where silent messages kept arriving one after the other, each stamped with official seals from different systems, some familiar, some new, all carrying the same message. A shift had occurred, and Earth had become the new center of gravity, around which the silence of space had begun to bend. Behind him, the tribunal's final declaration echoed in data form. The case against Earth was closed, the charges withdrawn, the accusations proven false, and the responsible parties placed under investigation. It was not just a legal victory, it was a signal, a quiet broadcast across every channel that Earth had not only stood its ground but had done so with precision and purpose, without drawing a blade, without issuing threats, without unleashing a fleet, and yet had still changed the direction of a galaxy. Reed closed the reports not because they were unimportant, but because their meaning had already reached him. They were proof of what he already knew. This mission was complete, not in words, but in what it would leave behind: new patterns of fear, new pockets of trust, and above all, new respect from those who once thought Earth was merely a young voice in an old room. The stars passed slowly outside the shuttle window, but Reed did not watch them. His thoughts were with what lay ahead, because victories in courtrooms never stayed untouched for long. They stirred new motives, awakened old rivalries, created questions that could not be answered by data alone, and somewhere in the background, forces would already be at work, rewriting their plans, shifting their tools, adapting to the realization that humans had entered the game not as pawns, but as players. He opened a secure file locked with triple keys, one that no one else could see, not even those who had trained him. It held profiles of systems under shadow control, data that Earth intelligence had gathered over years without moving a single ship into those regions. All passed through watchers, diplomats like him, men and women whose jobs were not to fire but to see. And now, with the tribunal shaken and exposed, some of those shadows would run while others would turn to smoke. But this was the space where Reed worked best, not under lights, not on stages, but in the corridors, behind closed doors, in the spaces between fear and assumption, where actions were not loud, yet had weight. He reviewed the list, made mental notes, and then erased the file from existence, not because it was over, but because everything that mattered was already locked inside his memory, ready for the next encounter, the next table, the next silent confrontation, where his calm voice would again become the loudest sound in the room. The shuttle approached a neutral station, orbiting a trade world built not by one race, but by many, and here Earth had arranged a new summit, one not forced by conflict, but invited by curiosity. For the first time in years, the other systems wanted to listen, not to accuse, not to dismiss, but to hear what Earth had to offer, and Reed would be the one. They would meet, not a general, not a scientist, not a negotiator, but him, the man they had seen rise without speaking louder. The man they now knew was more than a title, more than a representative, more than a suit. As The ship docked and the bay doors opened. He stepped out slowly, each step measured, each breath steady, and though the corridor was empty for now, he knew eyes watched from every angle, camera sensors, maybe even hidden agents waiting to read his movement, to guess his intention. And he gave them nothing, only posture, only presence, only the exact rhythm of a man who had nothing to hide, because he had already shown them the truth and knew they would never forget it. Inside the summit hall, voices paused when he entered. No announcement was needed. No banner, no introduction. His name was already etched into the whispers that passed from one delegate to another. They knew who he was. They knew what he had done, and more importantly, they knew what he could do if tested again. Walked to the center, stood with both hands behind his back, and waited, not demanding, not declaring, only allowing the silence to stretch until someone finally asked the question that brought it all into motion. What does Earth want now? And Reed answered with the calm certainty of a man who had already seen the answer. Earth wants peace that is shaped by truth, not silence. Earth wants respect that is earned through clarity, not fear. Earth wants to be part of the future, not because we ask, but because we belong. His voice did not rise yet. It struck like thunder across the chamber, not because of power, but because of purpose. And when the room settled, no one argued because they could not, because deep inside every delegate sitting, there was the same understanding. Earth had sent not a soldier, not a diplomat, not a politician, but a weapon crafted not of metal but of mind and will. In silence, when the meeting ended and the hall slowly emptied, Reed remained for a moment alone at the center of the room, not to savor victory, but to feel the change settle, the invisible turning of systems, the weight of a galaxy adjusting to a new presence. And then, as always, he turned and left, not fast, not slow, with the same quiet steps that had echoed through the tribunal, the same calm presence that had broken pride and peeled truth from lies. And as he walked down the corridor, away from the lights and the words, away from the questions and the stares, someone watching from a distance spoke softly into their recorder. He wears a suit, he speaks like a scholar, but he is not what he seems. He is not a man. He is a message, and every time he walks into a room, the room remembers the end.